Joining me live now is Jeremy Jones, Director of International and of Community Affairs at the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council. Thanks for your time today, Jeremy. A pretty shocking case. 11 people gunned down. Hearing about these victims, a 97-year-old, a couple, 84 and 86, gunned down without a chance, basically.
Yeah, it's unimaginable. I had been in Synagogue in Sydney that morning. It happened over Saturday night, Sunday morning, Sydney time. And the first item I hear on the world news is people who had gone to a sanctuary, who had gone to pray, who had been part of a community on a peaceful day in a peaceful place, had their lives taken upon them by somebody who was inspired by most bizarre understanding of the world, which translated into evil. Somebody who thought they were serving some purpose by murdering innocent people. Ever is unimaginable. But when it takes place in a place of worship, during a time of worship, it magnifies it. And I must say right at the outset, what has been so encouraging at this time is the show of support from so many different people, from political leaders who are very quick to make the condemnations that you would hope, the private messages I've been receiving from friends from all different religious backgrounds, from many countries in the world. I think we're finding a real understanding that when there's a targeting of somebody at prayer, that affects not just obviously them or their families, but has a ripple effect, and there are many others who feel that this was an attack on their right to be a human being.
So what's your thought, knowing the context we do about this shooter? Are we in the position that anyone can be radicalised by something they see online these days, or is there a genuine rise in anti-Semitism in the US?
Well, it's quite a complex picture, because if you look at the resilience of hateful language and speech and incitement against Jewish people around the world, it's certainly not a phenomenon of the internet age. It's certainly not something recent, and even physical attacks. There was a major story in one of the weekend newspapers about the 1982 attack on the Jewish social club, the Hakoah Club in Sydney, a place I was meant to be at the time the bomb went off. So I was very fortunate actually not to be there on that day. Then in 1991 there were a series of synagogue fires, which had Sydney being the city in the entire world up to that stage, the city in the entire world with the most attacks on synagogues of anywhere. And fortunately they weren't with people there. But when we look over the period of time, even in Australia, from so many different sources, there are people who have taken out their own intellectual capacity to deal with the world, their own psychological deficiencies. They've taken out with not just hateful rhetoric, but sometimes that rhetoric is translated into the horrific violence as we saw on this weekend in Pittsburgh.
Right, so referencing those fires, those series of a while ago now, do you feel like the situation in Australia is different, that there's much of that threat that lingers?
Well, I think what's really happened is the Jewish community in Australia and all around the world are quite alert to what is going on around us. We have antennae which are forced upon us by history. And I think what we have always tried to do is make sure that we understand what threat there might be to us and do what we can to avert that threat. So on the first level, something in Australia is we work, fortunately, with very sympathetic hearings with the political leaders, state and federal, who we know are as horrified by attacks on racial and religious minorities as the people in those groups are. So we know that this is not something which we can take for granted, but in Australia historically we have actually seen a development of more people understanding this. Secondly, we have the most advanced interfaith dialogue of anywhere in the world, which is also important of building up the coalition of those who are opposed to racism and opposed to hate. But also we have to take care of physical security. And for a long time in Australia, as with many other Jewish communities, the community would do what it can to take advice from the best sources, to work with the police, work with government, and our own community volunteer their time and services also, just to ensure that if something might be happening, we're in a position to minimise the ability of people who want to cause harm to do so. And it is something which is unfortunate. I know when we have guests in our synagogue and they say, isn't it odd we're coming to a place of worship in comfortable Australia, relaxed Australia, yet we have security to enter, as do the regulars who are going there each week. We don't just walk in and out, because unfortunately, around the world, and including in Australia, we know there are people who have hateful ideas, and what we want to do is stop those hateful ideas translating into action.
Right, because Donald Trump spoke about, well, there should be armed guards at synagogues, which was one of his comments. You're saying we already have, are they armed guards in synagogues in Australia, and does that extend to schools as well?
Now, what I would say is there are different circumstances in different places, and in every institution, in every place, the people who have authority will assess what is needed, what is required. And we know that the most important thing in Australia is having the police and security forces and the community as a whole alert and aware of potential threats so they can do everything necessary to make sure those don't translate from threats into action. America has a very different environment, and I wouldn't superimpose their ideas and their rhetoric into our situation.
Right, so are there armed guards in Australian Jewish schools at all?
Every institution would just do what is required in security at different times. So it's not that there's a general principle of what you do and you don't do. A physical security obviously is a very important part of that, but our most important security, as we know, is working with the state, working with the federal government, the police and everybody else to take into account what is needed to take into account to do the best to make sure that those who want to take away the rights of Jewish Australians just to enjoy our religion and our way of life and our social environment is not taken away from them. But when it comes down to specific requirements and what people do, that is going to be judged by institutions on a case-to-case basis.
Jeremy Jones, thanks for your time today.
My pleasure.